Namaste, Swadika, good evening. I'm Aparna Patwardhan, the director of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center, Embassy of India, Bangkok. Today, we are celebrating the 124th birth anniversary of one of India's greatest and bravest freedom fighters, Subhas Chandra Bose. Netaji, as he was known, pursued the goal of Purna Swaraj, that is complete independence from colonial rule. He inspired millions of Indians living in and outside India to participate in the freedom struggle. His act of hoisting the tricolour for the first time in Port Blair in 1943 and the declaration of Andaman and Nicobar Islands as the first Indian territory to be free from British rule continues to inspire every Indian. This year, we'll be celebrating the 125th birth year of Netaji. The government of India has declared this day as Parakram Divas to celebrate valor and courage. Today, we have with us Her Excellency Mrs. Suchitra Durai, Ambassador to Thailand. We'll now present her message to everybody.
Just 1 second, the video is coming up.
Namaskar, Sawadika. I'm very happy that the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center in Bangkok is celebrating the birth anniversary of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose in a befitting manner, because today also happens to be a very special day because it is also the commencement of the 125th birth anniversary celebrations of Netaji. As most people would be aware, Netaji was one of the tallest leaders of the Indian freedom struggle. He was a man of action and he took the cause of Indian independence outside of India and particularly in Southeast Asia, where he had a large number of followers and supporters, particularly in Thailand, which also saw the establishment of a Balak Sena. As many of you would also be aware, the Azad Hind Fauj or the Indian National Army, of which he was the supreme commander, also had a very large following here among Indians in Southeast Asia at that time. There are going to be other experts who are going to speak on the subject, so I will not dwell upon it. But I would like to share with you that the Government of India has decided to dedicate this day to honor his indomitable spirit and his selfless service to the nation by celebrating today as Parakram Divas. In fact, a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi also inaugurated a museum dedicated to Netaji's memory at the Red Fort, and also 3 islands in the Andaman and Nicobar group of islands have been renamed in memory of Netaji and the Azad Hind Fauj, including, of course, the Ross Island, which has been renamed as Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose Dweep, the Neel Island, which has been renamed as Shahid Dweep, and the Havelock Island, which is now called Swaraj Deep. So with that, I would close. But before that, I would also like to remind you that the exhortation that we always use in India, Jai Hind, was first used by Netaji in one of his public speeches abroad. So with that, I close. Thank you. Dhanyavad. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Today, we have invited Mr. Prasenjit K. Basu, who is the author of the book Asia Reborn, to speak on Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and the rebirth of Asia. I extend a warm welcome to Mr. Basu. As Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army, Netaji actively recruited volunteers into the Indian National Army from many parts of the world, especially from Southeast Asia. He also visited Bangkok during this phase. After Mr. Basu's talk, we'll be sharing the accounts of Netaji's visit to Bangkok and his recruitment of Indians in Thailand into the Indian National Army. Now I invite Mr. Prasenjit K. Basu, an economist and a noted author, to present his talk on Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and the rebirth of Asia. Mr. Basu.
Namaskar, Shubh Parakram Divas. This is the 124th birth anniversary of Netaji Subhas Bose, and it's a great opportunity to discuss his paramount role in the rebirth of Asia. And of course, his absolutely pivotal role in India's independence. India's independence was key to the end of empires in Asia. And so that is one thing I'll be talking about, but also the vision that Netaji had of economic development has been emulated by much of East Asia in the past 70 years, and is now being emulated, I will argue, by the Indian government, particularly the idea of the Niti Aayog as a think tank to help the states to successfully industrialize. But anyway, I'll get to that. Let me start with Netaji's career in brief. He, of course, resigned from the Indian Civil Service. He was the first Indian ever to have qualified fully for the Indian Civil Service, and then to have resigned and dedicated his life for the cause of the nation. The Indian Civil Service was much more elite an organization than the IAS. In those days, less than 10 people in the whole country, both Indians and foreign and Britishers, would obtain would get into the ICS every year. And Netaji, I think, of course, qualified. He came in, I think, third or fourth in his year, but he resigned from the ICS and dedicated his life to the cause of India. Soon after joining the national movement, he began to be imprisoned. He was imprisoned soon after. He became the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation, and that in those days, Calcutta was the largest city in Asia, and it was considered the second city of the British Empire. And so becoming Chief Executive Officer there at the age of 24 was a remarkable thing. But soon after becoming Chief Executive, he was imprisoned. And thereafter, by 1927, he became the mayor of Calcutta, elected mayor. In 1928, he called for Purna Swaraj. He introduced the call of Purna Swaraj into the Congress. And this was important because since 1907, the Congress had been happy to mainly try and demand dominion status from the British, not full independence. Netaji, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, introduced a resolution in the 1928 Congress requiring that the Congress should rededicate itself to Purna Swaraj. Gandhiji rejected this, and at the last moment, Jawaharlal Nehru defected from Netaji's side and voted against Purna Swaraj, and so it was defeated in 1928. But Gandhiji said that he wanted 1 year. In 1929, he said, give me the whole of 1929. And if I am unable to attain dominion status by the end of the year, I will become an independence wala as well. I will join the Purna Swaraj call. And so at the end of 1929, when dominion status did not come through, Gandhiji also became a so-called independence wala. He joined the Purna Swaraj call. And as a result, the 26th of January, 1930, was the day on which Congress on the banks of the River Ravi in Lahore declared that independence, Purna Swaraj, was the goal. And from that day on, 26 January until 1950, the next 20 years, 26 January was celebrated as India's Independence Day. Netaji, of course, had the pivotal role in calling for Purna Swaraj and getting that demand accepted by the whole of Congress over a 1.5 to 2 year period. Thereafter, of course, he was soon jailed again, and he was sent away to exile. Unlike Gandhiji and Jawaharlal Nehru and Motilal Nehru and others who were kept in fairly luxurious jails, the true enemies of the British Empire were sent into exile. So Lokmanya Tilak in 1908 was sent into exile. Even bigger enemies were sent into, were either executed or or sent away to Kalapani or the cellular jail in Port Blair in the Andaman Islands. But like Lokmanya Tilak in 1908, Netaji was sent away to Mandalay in Burma, so outside India, so that he would be out of the hair of the British, and solitary confinement in Mandalay with torture, etc. as well. And while he was there, he began to lay out a vision for Purna Swaraj and how India could develop economically, and in particular, he focused on education as a key goal. Universal literacy, and particularly literacy of women, were areas that he began to focus on a great deal. After his period in Mandalay, when he fell ill, he was sent into exile out of Asia and sent into Europe into exile. And he wasn't allowed back into India until after the 1937 election. The 1937 election was the first time that the Congress participated in provincial elections across India. The British allowed everybody else to participate, but made sure that Bose could not come into India, come out of jail until after the election was over, for obvious reasons. But nonetheless, by then, he had become an important enough leader of the country for the Congress to resolve that in 1938, he should become the president of Congress. And one of the important things that Netaji did when he was president of Congress in 1938 was to introduce the idea of a planning committee. So in 1941, Netaji managed to get out of India, and eventually the British did not know where he was. So they sent assassination squads to Basra and Baghdad in Iraq, and to Istanbul in Turkey, with the aim of killing Subhash Bose. But they were on the wrong track, of course, because he had gone via Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, and Italy to reach Germany. But he remained incognito for quite a while, and finally resurfaced only on the 17th of February 1942, 2 days after the fall of Singapore, when Singapore was liberated from British rule by the Japanese forces. Of course, not everybody considers it a liberation. I think it was. Just before that, of course, there had been a Franco-Thai war. So since I'm talking to partly a Thai audience, Plek Phibun Songram. Phibun was the leader of that war, and he then became the Prime Minister of Thailand right through the Second World War. And Phibun was to become a very close ally of Netaji, and somebody who helped the Indian Independence League and the Indian National Army to get established in Thailand and then in the rest of Southeast Asia. But in any case, in 1941, in the early stages of the war, Thailand regained a lot of the territory that it had lost to France in the previous 30 or 40 years. It regained it through the Franco-Thai War in January 1941, and Phibun played a big part in that. France, of course, was led by the so-called Vichy forces at that time. But anyway, that was a little aside on Thailand. But thereafter, you had Netaji broadcasting to India quite regularly from the 17th of February 1942 onwards, and he was calling for a revolution, and he began to assemble an Azad Hind Force out of prisoners of war in Europe, particularly in Germany, and a small army emerged from there. It was to become the core of a small Azad Hind Force, and it was there that Netaji came up with the slogan of Jai Hind, that is still used across the country. But it took almost a year until February 1943 before the Germans made a U-boat available to Netaji. A U-boat is a kind of submarine that sailed from Kiel in the north of Germany all the way across Europe in hostile waters, right through the Cape of Good Hope and off the waters of Madagascar. Netaji and his close ally Abid Hassan changed from the German U-boat. They shifted on the high seas via a dinghy to a Japanese submarine, and the Japanese submarine then took them to what is now Sumatra in Indonesia, and from there he flew via Singapore to Tokyo to establish an alliance with the Japanese forces. He won the Prime Minister of Japan over to the side of the emerging Indian National Army, and then he flew back to Singapore to start recruiting a large Indian National Army, or Azad Hind Fauj. And then on the 6th of July, 1943, Netaji addressed a huge audience at the Padang, the main concourse which still exists, the main sports ground right in front of City Hall in Singapore. And he addressed a mammoth audience. And he said then that his purpose was not to create an Indian National Army that could defeat the million-strong British Indian Army at war, but the purpose was to ensure that this small Azad Hind Fauj would not only be an independent army that was not beholden to anybody else, but fighting purely for India's independence, but it would also be aimed at ensuring that the British Indian Army realized that they were an occupying army in India and that they were fighting on the wrong side. So he was aiming to take the Indian National Army into India and thereby to try and foment an uprising of the British Indian Armed Forces against the empire. So this was similar to what the Ghadar Party had done in the First World War. The Ghadar Party was led in the First World War by two men, Lala Hardayal from San Francisco in California, and inside India by a man called Rash Bihari Bose. And Rash Bihari Bose had in fact played the key role in the Ghadar Party rebellion in the First World War. Afterwards, he escaped to Japan and lived as an Indian nationalist in Japan. And he, along with Satyendra Puri in Bangkok, formed the Indian Independence League in East Asia. The Indian Independence League was the key organization that helped form the first INA soon after the fall of Singapore in February 1942. But the INA that was formed by Netaji was a much larger force. It included not only men, but also women. It is the first army in Asia in modern times to include women. Of course, the Maratha armies had included women in the 18th century as well, and the 19th century, as we know. Rani Lakshmibai was a prominent one, but there were others like Tarabai and other great Maratha women warriors. But Rani Lakshmibai was the inspiration for the formation of the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, which was the first modern Asian army with a women's regiment. And it was to be led by somebody who shared the name of Lakshmibai, Lakshmi Swaminathan, who later became Lakshmi Saigal after she married General Prem Saigal of the INA. But he formed this, and of course, it was initially formed in Singapore, but there was tremendous support from other places in Southeast Asia, including Bangkok and the rest of Thailand, where the importance of Thailand, of course, was that it was a completely independent country. It was the one country in Asia that was independent, apart from Japan, independent of any European or American rule, and therefore had freedom of choice. And Thailand played a big part in providing assistance to the INA and the IIL in the early period. And Netaji came to Bangkok to recruit. He also went to Saigon in Vietnam, Saigon and Hanoi in Vietnam. He went to Beijing and Shanghai, where Wang Jingwei was ruling. Wang Jingwei was a former Prime Minister of China who had switched over to a Japanese allied army. And then of course he also went to Manila in the Philippines. So all across Southeast Asia and Jakarta and Surabaya in Indonesia. So all across Southeast Asia, civilians joined, and what is now Malaysia as well, large numbers of people joined the Indian National Army. And the INA on the 30th of December 1943 acquired territory for the first time. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands were handed over and were renamed the Swaraj and Shahid Islands by Netaji, and the Provisional Government of Free India that he had formed in Singapore on the 21st of October 1943. So he had formed a Provisional Government of Free India. That Provisional Government of Free India had its own gold-backed currency. It raised all the funds that the INA needed to fight from its own sources. The sources were the approximately 2 million people of Indian origin across East Asia. And many of them voluntarily contributed a form of taxation, you could say, to the Provisional Government of Free India. And it became a very successful and effective and independent entity. Thereafter, in 1944, early 1944, Netaji moved the headquarters to Rangoon or Yangon, what is now called Yangon in Myanmar, then called Burma. And if you go to Burma, you can still see the massive headquarters of the INA. Next to the headquarters of the INA was the much smaller headquarters of the Burma National Army, headed by a young man called Aung San. Aung San's daughter, Aung San Suu Kyi, is currently the effective president of Myanmar, or the country that she always preferred to call Burma. So the INA headquarters was much larger in Rangoon or Yangon, much larger than the BNA, the Burma National Army headquarters, because the INA was a much larger entity. It had at its peak as many as 60,000 soldiers, including about 25,000 recruits from among the civilian populations of Southeast Asia. And in April 1944, the INA entered Indian territory and raised the flag of Free India at a place called Moirang in Manipur. For the first time, the Free India flag was planted in Moirang, and the Provisional Government of Free India was established at Moirang at the home of a man called Mairembang Koireng Singh. 20 years later, in fact, 24 years later, Mairembang Koireng Singh was to become the first chief minister of Manipur. But during the war, he played a key role in welcoming the Provisional Government of Free India into his home. And Manipur was liberated. Almost the whole of Manipur was liberated and was governed by the Provisional Government of Free India for about 2 or 3 months. A massive war, of course, was raging then. And in Nagaland, the person who welcomed the Provisional Government of Free India and the Azad Hind Fauj was A.Z. Fizo, Angami Fizo, who in 1951 was to declare that Nagaland wanted to secede from India. One of the reasons he gave for wanting to secede was because he had fought on the side of the INA for India's independence. But this fight had not been recognized by the government of independent India. But in any case, both the key leaders of the Nagas as well as the Manipuris fully cooperated in welcoming the Provisional Government of Free India. And we know of some evidence from oral sources that Netaji himself spent at least a month and a half in a village in Nagaland, conducting the army's work and the government's work in those areas that had been liberated from British rule. Unfortunately, of course, that year in 1944, the monsoons arrived early, and the Japanese did not agree with Netaji's plan of trying to get to first Dimapur and then into Assam. He wanted to either get to Assam proper or into Chittagong in eastern Bengal, where he would be able to foment a much bigger revolution. Unfortunately, around that time, Jawaharlal Nehru visited Assam just before the war, just before the INA had come in, and he said that he would, if Mr. Bose came there with his army, he, Nehru, would fight him with a sword in his hand. This is something the INA veterans have never forgotten. It was also a signal to the British that he was on their side rather than on the side of Indian patriotism. This is fairly well known, but it was a tragic moment in India's freedom struggle. But of course, though, the monsoons came a little early. They came at the end of May, around the 26th, 27th of May, and that contributed to making the supply lines much tougher for the INA and their Japanese allies. And on the other hand, the US Air Force played a big part in providing supplies to the British Indian Army, and that changed the course of the war. And by July, the INA was forced to start retreating from Manipur and Nagaland. These were two of the most climactic battles of the Second World War: the Battle of Imphal and the Battle of Kohima, and they began to withdraw. But what was interesting was that the INA then fought a tremendous battle in Burma at a place called Mount Popa in 1945. And just before that Battle of Mount Popa, the BNA, the Army of Aung San, in March 1945, the Army of Aung San switched sides from the Japanese to the British side. And many people in the INA were suggesting to Netaji that he should do the same. Why not join the British side? But Netaji said there is nothing that will make him switch to the British side. Also because there were millions of Indians who could then suffer reprisals from the Japanese, and so there was no question of switching sides. So he continued to fight, and then of course, on the 17th of August 1945, soon after Japan had surrendered, the trail of Netaji's life seems to have ended, and no one is clear what happened to him then. But what we do know is that as a result of the INA fighting, the loyalty of the British Indian Armed Forces began to be undermined. And this became evident when the INA trials began. The INA trials began on the 5th of November, 1945. Before that, the British military had put out a secret paper, a strategic paper for the British cabinet in May 1945, talking about what needed to be done to keep full British control of India and the Indian Ocean area for the next 15 years. And that paper talked about the need for some modest constitutional changes along the lines of the 1935 Government of India Act, which basically would give provincial autonomy to some of the Indian states, like after the 1937 election, and a kind of diluted form of dominion rule at best, dominion status at best for India, if that. So there was no question of India getting independence at that point. And this is something that is often overlooked in the way the story is told of 1945, 46, 47. There was no question of India getting independence. And in fact, but of course, they wanted to have elections to the central legislature and as well as to the provincial legislatures. So, but at the same time, the British began the trials of 3 senior officers who had surrendered at Mount Popa in Burma. They were called Prem Saigal, Shahnawaz Khan, and Dhillon. So these 3, one a Hindu, one a Muslim, one a Sikh, were tried at the Red Fort. And when the trial began, the Indian people heard for the first time. During the war, there was complete censorship of all news of the INA. They were just called JIFs, or Japanese-inspired forces. They were, some refer to them as quislings. And it was made to seem as if there was nothing that had threatened the British during the war on the side of the INA. But during the trial, the prosecution side began to talk about the battles that had been fought by the INA, the territory that the INA had gained and lost, the areas that the INA had ruled. So when the INA trial culminated on the 3rd and 4th of January 1946, the India, General 3 officers would effectively be acquitted. And this was a sensational outcome, because the original idea was that they were to be, normally, high treason requires execution. But instead of, they were not only not executed or hanged, they were not even to be sent into life in prison, which was the second option. Instead, they were fully acquitted. And Auchinleck, a few days later, wrote to his senior officers saying why he had done this. And he did this because he had discussed the situation with the senior officers of the British Indian Army, and he asked them whether their men would be willing to remain loyal to the British if the 3 senior officers of the INA were either executed or sent to prison. And he was told very clearly that all the men, all the soldiers of the British Indian Army were nationalists now, and it was not going to be possible for them, for the officers to hold their loyalty. And in fact, he asked the Indian officers whether they themselves were loyal still to the British. And most of them said, "Sir, don't ask difficult or impossible questions." And so it was clear that officers and men of the British Indian Army had become nationalists as well. And in fact, if you read Maulana Azad's biography, Maulana Azad was then the president of Congress. And Maulana Azad says that wherever he went in the country, soldiers would come up to him. "We are with you. Please go ahead." And dramatic change from the past. The British Indian Army was what held the edifice of Britain's and all European empires in Asia together. In fact, at that very time, the British Indian Army was fighting the Battle of Surabaya in the Indonesian Republic and restored Dutch rule in Indonesia. And similarly, the British Indian Army was fighting in Vietnam to remove Ho Chi Minh's allies, particularly in the south of Vietnam, and enable the French to take control of South Vietnam in particular. And so this was happening at that very time. But in India, the Indian Army was beginning to become disloyal to the British. So that is the reason why Auchinleck basically acquitted the 3 senior-most officers of the INA who were on trial. And the idea was to preclude or forestall the potential for a mutiny in the Indian Armed Forces. Auchinleck's plan, unfortunately, did not work because within less than a fortnight, the Royal Air Force began to mutiny. 50,000 Royal Air Force officers in India, officers and men of the Royal Air Force began to mutiny. The Royal Indian Air Force, almost all the Indians in the Royal Indian Air Force joined the mutiny. And then on the 8th of February, 1946, a huge mutiny or insurrection began in the main signals ship of the Royal Indian Navy. The Royal Indian Navy's main signal ship was rebadged as the Indian National Naval Ship, INNS Talwar. And 78 out of 88 ships of the Royal Indian Navy were rebadged as Indian National Naval Ships in honor of the INA. And so they were now saying, we are the Indian National Navy. Just as Netaji created an Indian National Army, we are now an Indian National Navy. Every shore establishment, every port of the Royal Indian Navy joined the rebellion. And 78 out of 88 ships joined it by the 18th of February, within 10 days, 18th of February, 1946. And so when the British were forced to this, Wavell basically cabled desperately, Viceroy Wavell desperately cabled the British government saying, we need 3 battalions of pure British troops to be sent to India to suppress the rising rebellion of the Navy and Air Force in India. Attlee said, there is no such thing available. We have no battalions to send. We cannot send a single British soldier. Nobody wants to fight. So on the 19th of February, 1946, for the first time, a British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, announced that he would be sending a cabinet mission, a mission of 3 of his senior-most cabinet officers, negotiate India's independence. That was the day, 19 February 1946. That was the day the British Empire ended. In fact, not only the British Empire, but all European empires were effectively done on that day, because from that day on, it was clear that India had to be given independence. Once India had independence, it was going to be very difficult for Britain to hold on to others. And if it didn't have the British Indian Army, it was going to be impossible for Britain to help its allies, like the Dutch and the French, to hold on to their empires. And so ultimately, it was, in fact, the INA and the fact that it fomented insurrections in the Navy, the Air Force, and also in the Jabalpur and the Madras regiments of the Indian Army. That is what ultimately ended the British Empire in Asia, and particularly in India. So this is, of course, a story that is not that well known in India. It is given short shrift. It receives, the RIN mutiny is given maybe one or two paragraphs in our official history books, but this is the real story. And it is the story of how Netaji he continued the story of what had happened in 1857 to 1859. We also don't know the real story of 1857 to 1859, because then, during that period, Nana Sahib, Tatya Tope, Rani Lakshmibai, Firoz Shah, the grandson of Bahadur Shah Zafar, Bakht Khan, Mullah Ahmadullah Shah of Faizabad or Ayodhya, these great heroes had driven the British out of North India in the months between May and September of 1857, and others began to. Tatya Tope particularly crossed Narmada in 1850 on the 30th of October 1858, and led to the proclamation by Queen Victoria that she was going to become the Empress of India, and would promise that Indians would have the right to retain their faiths and their faiths, that is their religion, and Britain would stop interfering in the personal freedoms of Indians. So there was, in fact, even 1858 had an important result. Once Tatya Tope crossed the Narmada and was about to head towards Nagpur and the Maratha heartlands, the British conceded India's personal freedoms. It did not concede political freedom until the INA trials brought the British to their knees with the mutiny of the Navy, Air Force, and Army. And so that ultimately is what led to India's freedom. Anyway, then of course we know the story of what happened over the next 18 months. Britain ensured that you had a partition that served supposedly strategic purposes for the British, but it was ultimately not ahimsa alone. Ahimsa, of course, had played an important role in mobilizing Indian people. So had Lokmanya Tilak and Sri Aurobindo in 1907-08. Their Swadeshi movement had a huge role as well. All these played an important part. But the ultimate, the final nail in the coffin of the British Empire was the INA trials and the fact that they fomented a rebellion in the British Indian Army, Air Force, and Navy. And so, and that is why I think it is particularly appropriate that today we celebrate Parakram Divas, or the Day of Valor, because it is the valor and courage of Netaji and the army that he led, the Azad Hind Fauj, that ultimately brought us our freedom. Now, not just that, I would say that if you look at Netaji's role in Southeast Asia during the period that he was there, he had other ideas of how to build a nation. And the important ideas that he had were, of course, already experimented with in 1938 by the Planning Committee. And basically what he wanted with the Planning Committee was to have a form of state capitalism with a very important role for private capital, but supplemented by the creation of modern industries. This was essentially the role, this was essentially the strategy adopted by Japan in the aftermath of the Second World War. Japan and then Korea and Taiwan adopted what I would call the Netaji method of economic development by providing strategic support to specific industries over time, initially labor-intensive manufacturing, and then moving up the value chain to resource-based manufacturing, and then to more capital-intensive things like steel and cars and ships. So a step-by-step process of economic development was what Netaji had envisaged through the Planning Committee. And to a large extent, it is now, as of 2020, with the liberalization of the labor market and the implementation of new farm laws that allow the play of genuine free market forces in agriculture, not just in industry, which began after 1991, but also in agriculture. We now have the basis for emulating what Netaji wanted India to do, which is basically pursue a path very similar pursued after the Second World War, and what was then emulated by Korea and Taiwan, and then by Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. So steadily across East Asia, the model that was adopted was very akin to the model that Netaji had wanted for India. It has taken us a long time to emulate that in India itself. But I think that the creation of a Niti Aayog, rather than a planning commission that would direct capital in particular areas, we now have a Niti Aayog that is very similar to the planning committee that Netaji had envisaged. And so we are now beginning to see the implementation of a vision very similar to the vision that Netaji had for India, that has been adopted in East Asia already in the intervening 70 years. And all you need to do is, Indians need to go to East Asia and see how much progress occurred in East Asia as a result of adopting this pattern of economic development. So now, one other thing that I'll say is that in 1956, there was an important strategic event in Asia, and that was that the Suez Canal had been built by the British and French, and they controlled passage through the Suez Canal. Egypt under Nasser, Jamal Abdel Nasser, decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. And when he decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, the British and the French went to war against Nasser. But what was interesting, of course, was that they did not have the British Indian Army. In the past, in the First World War, the British Indian Army had fought in what is today Egypt, and especially in Iraq. They had fought several battles in Iraq. The British Indian Army in the First World War had so-called liberated Jerusalem from Ottoman rule and Haifa. So if you go to the Teen Murti statue in the center of New Delhi, it commemorates the role of 3 states from India who had sent troops to help liberate Haifa from Ottoman rule. Well, some call it a liberation. Others will say, well, we're not too sure it was a liberation. But anyway, that the Indian army played a big part there. And in the Second World War as well, the British Indian Army, of course, had fought everywhere. They fought in North Africa against Rommel. So when you look at the importance of the Battle of El Alamein, in which General Bernie Montgomery led the so-called Allied forces against Rommel, almost the entire army fighting under Montgomery was the Indian Army. That same army was then moved from North Africa to Southeast Asia. They were not really trained for jungle warfare, but they were then supposed to fight off the Japanese when they arrived in Malaya. It was all Indian Army fighting everywhere. So every battle that the British fought in Asia from 1839 onwards was fought by Indian troops. And the Indian troops were absolutely essential to the continuance of the British Empire across Asia, and not just the British Empire, but all European empires. It was the key that held the entire edifice of Western empires in Asia together. So once the British Indian Army was no longer loyal, it was no longer possible for Britain to have its way in Asia. And that became clear in 1956. During the Suez Crisis, the British did not get their way. And eventually, the British had to withdraw. The British and the French were forced to withdraw from the Suez Canal. And Egyptian sovereignty was fully reestablished. That was the final nail in the coffin of the entire British Empire. It was in 1957 that Britain decided to give independence to Malaya or Malaysia. Singapore was given its independence of sorts in 1959. And in 1956, the British left Ghana in Africa as well. And Ghana was the first African country that the Europeans left. And beginning with that, over the course of the next 10 years, you had a very rapid decolonization across the world. So all that only happened because the British and the French were taught a lesson that without the Indian Army, they could not even hold on to any of their empire, including Egypt. And as a consequence, they had to leave. Now, it's important for us to relook at our history and understand why it was that the British left. They were forced to give India personal freedom on the 1st of November, 1858. On that day, Britain promised that they would no longer interfere in Indians' religious practices. That is a promise that they made on the 1st of November, 1858. Because Tatya Tope had crossed the Narmada and was about to reach the old Maratha homelands in Nagpur and elsewhere. And if he had done that, there would be an uprising in the Bombay and Madras armies, which had not joined the 1857 rebellion. Similarly, it was on 19th of February, 1946, that Britain finally said that we are going to negotiate India's political independence. And so political independence arrived, not just through ahimsa, but also primarily through undermining the loyalty of the British Indian Army, which was the basis of not just Britain's empire in Asia, but all European empires. And so I offer my pranams to Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose on this day, his 124th birth anniversary. And I offer my thanks to the current government of India for recognizing the primary importance of Netaji Subhas and the valor not only of Netaji, but of his entire army, the Azad Hind Fauj, as well as those that it inspired, the unknown sailors of the Indian National Navy and the Indian National Air Force, as well as those in the British Indian Army from Jabalpur and Madras regiments who mutinied against the British in February 1946 and finally forced the British to leave India. Thank you very much for listening. And I apologize for all the technical difficulties, but I'm happy to now open the floor to some questions, if you have any. Jai Hind and Jai Parakram Divas.
Thank you so much, Mr. Basu, for throwing light on so many unknown aspects of our history and for the significance of the Indian National Army's role and Subhas Bose's role in getting independence. The audience, please kindly go ahead. If anybody has any questions, they can put it across to Mr. Basu. Meanwhile, I will just ask a question of you, Mr. Basu. In your book, Asia Reborn, you talk about an underlying unity among all Asian countries. What is the promise that it holds today's context? What is that underlying unity? What is the role of that underlying unity for India and the Southeast Asian countries today?
Well, if you look at the history of Southeast Asia, India had very, very close ties to Southeast Asia through most of history. And the fact that in Thailand, the king of Thailand, the current king of Thailand is King Rama the 10th. The previous king was King Rama the 9th. So we've had 10 kings of the Chakri dynasty who are called Ram. The previous capital of Thailand was Ayutthaya, which is as clear as possible for us Indians to understand. And similarly, if you look across Southeast Asia, the links between India and Southeast Asia are deep. So if we go back to the great University of Nalanda that existed in what is today Bihar, during the time of the Guptas established Nalanda, and it remained a hugely important destination for scholars from the whole of East Asia. So people from, in Nalanda, there was a college called the Sri Vijaya College. where students from what is today Indonesia would come and they had a college of their own. In the Srivijaya College was a college for Indonesians. What today we think of as Indonesians. And of course, great scholars like Faxian of China and Xuanzang of China came and spent as many as 10 years in Nalanda looking for knowledge, seeking knowledge. And there was strong interactions over the centuries between India and China, India and Southeast Asia. The Pallavas particularly had a huge role across Southeast Asia. And so these are links that existed between India and East Asia that were very deep. But of course, they predated the colonial period. And so as we begin to think about interactions between India and Southeast Asia, all we need to do is to begin to dig a little bit into history. If you go to the Royal Palace in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, the walls of the National Palace, the Royal Palace, are filled with murals from the Ramayana. If you go to the center of Jakarta in Indonesia, there is a magnificent statue right in front of the Bank Indonesia building in Jakarta. Right in the center, the most central place in the capital of Indonesia is a statue called the Arjuna Vijaya statue. It shows Arjuna with Sri Krishna giving him the Bhagavad Gita effectively. And it is right in the center of the capital of Indonesia. So the links between India and Southeast Asia are so deep that it is a shame that we haven't fully sought to mine this as a source of cultural exchange and also of political alliances and ways in which we can build stronger and deeper ties between India and East Asia. Of course, recently India made the decision not to join RCEP. Unfortunately, at the moment, we are faced with a country in Asia, China, communist China, which is an imperial power. It wants to take over the whole of Asia. It took over Tibet, which is always an independent country, in 1950. It wants to take over Taiwan, which was not part of China for most of the last 150 years. It wants, and of course, across the South China Sea, China is trying to gain more and more territory. And of course, it's now trying to gain territory in India's Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. So given that, RCEP is not the ideal way for India to establish deeper ties with Asia, but India already has an FTA with ASEAN. India already has an FTA with South Korea and with Japan. So the relations are deep and are deepening. We need to continue to deepen those relationships because those are mutually beneficial. If China decides to move away from its imperial foreign policy and become a friendly nation again, then we will surely look to deepen economic ties with China as well. But at the moment, China is an imperial power and it is a danger to India. And so I think it's a good idea not to be a member of RCEP under current conditions. We already have an FTA with ASEAN. We already have FTAs with South Korea and Japan for the last 10 years. And if you move around India, you find Japanese and Korean brands ubiquitous. You also find that SsangYong Motor of Korea is owned by Mahindra of India. You're beginning to find a lot of Indian tech people in Japan and across the rest of Asia. So those interactions need to continue. There is a long history that we can build on. That history goes back centuries. So, I mean, that's a very long answer to your wonderful question, Aparna, but there it is.
Thank you so much. It will be incomplete if you do not share the accounts of people who have been associated with the INA. We have a couple of people who have shared their accounts of Netaji's visit to Thailand, to Bangkok in the 1940s. So we'll play those accounts now. One is Mr. Sushil Dhanuka. He's the Joint Secretary of Thai-Bharat Cultural Lodge. And the other is Mr. Rakesh Matta. He's the Secretary of Thai-Bharat Cultural Lodge. They're very closely associated with propagating Netaji's work here in Thailand. I request Mr. Nagraj to play the two videos.
Namaskar. I am Sushil Dhanuka and have been associated with Thai-Bharat Cultural Lodge since 1984. This association is the oldest association in Thailand, which is working as a bridge between India and Thailand. And it is run by both Thai and Indian nationals. This association was brainchild of Sri Guru Rabindranath Tagore, who, after his visit to Bangkok in 1927, he felt strongly that an association should be established in Thailand, which will work to bring the cultural relation in between these two great countries more closer. Because he felt strongly in this, he sent the scholar Sri Swami Satyanand Puriji from India. Swamiji stayed here up to his last breath and established the Thai-Bharat Culture Laws with the help of the local Indian community. He was mainly assisted in this by Sri Raghunath Sharma. In 1941, Swami Satyanand Puri wanted to help with the Indian freedom struggle. He formed the Indian National Council with the help of Thai-Bharat Culture Laws and the local Indian community for this cause. He was the founding president of this council. He started lots of activities toward the freedom struggle of India. In 1943, Netaji Subhas Bose arrived in Singapore from Germany, by which time the Indian Independence League was already active in Southeast Asia, whose leader was Ras Bihari Bose. Ras Bihari Bose at that time was stationed in Japan. In a very short time, Netaji Subhas Bose was made president of this league and Indian National Army, which is called INA. With the efforts of Netaji and the Japanese, he formed a strong army of 30,000 soldiers. These soldiers were Indian POWs serving in British India Army and were being held captive in Singapore. The daily practice and exercise of this army were held at Sanam Luang here in Bangkok also. The Indian business community of Bangkok, including Hindus, Sikhs and Namdaris and all sorts of other Indian nationals, helped wholeheartedly by giving money to Netaji for this noble cause. Netaji also formed the Balak Sena, whose main job was to distribute pamphlets and the information from the British Army and to work as a communication link between the INA and the British Army. The details of this Balak Sena will be given to you by Mr. Rakesh Matta. Netaji also started broadcasting news of freedom struggle by establishing a radio station called Azad Hind Radio. The news and contents was beamed to India and made available to audience there. Netaji in his broadcast messages repeatedly appealed to Indians to support the INA and to help bring down the fall of the British Empire. He also warned that those who supported the British Army were rendering disservice to their motherland. Netaji gave us the famous slogan, Chalo Delhi, which means let's go to Delhi. And tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga. Meaning, you give me blood and I will give you freedom. Such slogans encourage the Indian community to contribute by tan, man, dhan. Means by body, by mind and wealth. Lesser known is the fact that he popularized the use of Jai Hind instead of any other greeting. This greeting is still used today when two Indians meet in Bangkok. The contribution and the sacrifice made by the Indian community living in South Asia through their association with Netaji have not been highlighted properly by historians. I have scanned and read so many books written on the India's freedom struggle, and to my utter disgust, there is no mention of this contribution made by the Indian community living in Singapore and Bangkok at that time. I strongly feel that a proper research needs to be done to recognize the contribution made by this entire community. Netaji was a great son of India who sacrificed his whole life to liberate India from the British. We Indians living in Thailand feel proud that Netaji lived here and that the Indian community of Thailand had contributed towards the freedom of India. In end, I would like to congratulate Vivekananda Cultural Center, Bangkok, for conducting the webinar on Netaji Subhas Bose, and also I am very much thankful to Center for giving me the opportunity to be part of this webinar. Jai Hind, Namaste.
Namaste and Jai Hind. My name is Rakesh Matta. I'm the second generation of Indian born in Thailand in my family. My kids are the third. I'm presently the secretary of Thai-Bharat Culture Lodge, an organization established in 1940 by Swami Satyanand Puri. This organization is to create and build the relationship, close relationship between India and Thailand. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about Subhas Chandra Bose, Netaji. Maybe many of you will think, how come I'm going to talk about him? I mean, actually, I don't know much about him. I'm going to talk to you about Subhas Chandra Bose, Netaji, through the eyes and experience with Netaji of my father. My father used to tell me how he traveled from India to Thailand with his aunt and uncle, taking about 3 weeks to travel. He had a special love and admiration for Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. I used to remember when I was very young, he used to celebrate Netaji's birthday every year at Thai-Bharat Culture Lodge on the 23rd of January. Well, on that same day was my sister's birthday in the family. He will never forget Netaji's birthday because he has to go celebrate in Thai-Bharat Culture Lodge. But he needed to be reminded that on that day was his daughter's birthday too. Netaji had made many special visits to Thailand to talk about his independence ideas and plans. So in one of those visits, my father had a chance to go to the stage and the Indian National Army to organize Balak Sena. Balak Sena was meant for boys below 18 years of age. So a day before the military camp was going to be organized at Chonburi, a town about 150 kilometers away from Bangkok. My uncle and my aunt came to know that my father was planning to go to the camp. So they locked him in his room on the second floor from the outside. In the morning, when he was ready to go, he realized that his room was locked from the outside. And being on the second floor, there was no other chances to go out, so only through the window. And the window, there were bars on the window. And he told me, I don't know from where he got the strength. He pulled the bars apart, and he slipped through the bars. He was very thin at that age, and he jumped from the second floor down onto the ground floor. And having checked his legs and everything was okay, he ran outside before his uncle and auntie came to know. So with very few paisa or satangs in his pocket, he could hardly go far in a public transport. So after getting down from a public transport, he had to run through the fields, cross the canals by walking over water pipes, balancing it, or otherwise he would fall into the canal. He reached slightly late and his friends were worried. When he arrived, his friends were very happy and shouted, "Gandhi, Gandhi." He was very warmly welcomed and proceeded to the camp. A few days later, his aunt and uncle visited him. The duty of Bharat Sena was to create patriotism among the soldiers, British soldiers, among the Indian soldiers who were serving the British Empire in Thailand, and to create patriotism among the local Indians living in Thailand. My father was involved in making pamphlets, printing the pamphlets with his friends and distributing it to the people, the Indians, putting on the shops, putting on the walls of the shops with the photo of Subhash, Netaji saluting the Indian flag and written there Jai Hind. And some pamphlets written in patriotic poetry, things like that. So all this has to be done underground, hidden from the eyes of the Britishers. So they needed money for this. What they did was they had agreement with the Indian soldiers who were staying in the British camps, serving the British camps. The Indian soldiers used to bring things from the British camp in which they would go and sell and divide the money between the Indian soldier and the underground movement. The printing charges for the pamphlets was very high, as it was a great risk of getting caught. So the owner of the printing factory also had asked the boys who were printing the pamphlets and the Bharat Sena to make a promise that they will never reveal the name of the printer. And it's like my father used to tell me, like they have to cut the finger and take the blood, put it on the Indian flag. It's like in the movies, that you will never reveal the name of the printer. On some occasions, to get more money, they cooperated with the Indian soldiers and the local truck drivers. They took the trucks, went to the British camp in the middle of the night, broke down the door, opened the door with the help of the Indian soldier there, and they used to steal the goods from the camp, put it on a truck, and go and sell locally in the market, and divide half to the truck drivers and half to the cause, the Bharat Sena cause, to print the process underground. One day he was caught. The British soldiers came to know that he was behind, or one of the leaders printing all these pamphlets. So, with soldiers and some Britishers, they came over to my dad's uncle's shop, and they took him for interrogation. He was jailed for 4 nights, and I think that time his age was about 13. And they had asked him a lot of questions to reveal the name of the printer, to reveal the name of his friends, but he never revealed. Finally, he had told them bluntly that maximum you can do to me is kill me, but I will never reveal you the name. So it's fruitless for you to torture me. Finally, after a few hours, they let him go. As he left the detention place, he saw that some of his friends all gathered, about 15-20 of his friends gathered around, and they were shouting slogans against the Britishers and asking them to release Gandhi. That's the nickname for my father. The love for his country and the thought of what he did for his country and the experience he had with Netaji and the love for him, that's what kept him happy and joyful even in the last days of his life. Thank you.
It is simply phenomenal, the kind of support that Netaji garnered from within and outside India. So many people outside India who supported this movement. I would like to thank you so much, Mr. Basu, for speaking at our event, on a virtual event today. We learned a lot of unknown facets of our history. I don't see any Q&A as of now from our Facebook audience. If there's anything else you wish to add to what we just heard from our Thai Indian community, I would let you speak. Mr. Basu, is there anything you wish to add?
Well, I would like to just repeat the sentiment that we as a nation cannot forget the enormous contributions made by the civilian population of Southeast Asia, of Thailand, of Singapore, of Malaya, of what is now Indonesia, even to some degree the Philippines, Vietnam, all of whom voluntarily joined Netaji's struggle, contributed to his cause. Also in Burma, particularly in Myanmar, there were thousands of people who gave almost everything they had to help finance the war that the Azad Hind Fauj was fighting for India's independence. And it is tragic that we as a nation have taken so long to begin to even recognize the huge role that these civilians played, these patriots played in India's cause. I have met many hundreds of INA veterans in Southeast Asia during my time. In fact, once I was playing a cricket match and the umpire was not giving me LBW. I was out 2 or 3 times, but he didn't give me LBW. And afterwards I said, I asked the umpire, what happened? I mean, you are very kind to me. And he said, your name is Basu, is it not? I said, yes. He said, Basu and Bose is the same name. I am an INA veteran. How can I give you out? so I had some, so this is one. And then, but I also met Janaki Thevar. Janaki Thevar was the deputy commander of the Rani Jhansi regiment. And she described how, as a 15-year-old, she was inspired when Netaji spoke at outside Kuala Lumpur's main railway station in what is now the Royal Selangor Club. The great ground there, he spoke. And she immediately joined the INA. And her father was shocked that his daughter wanted to join an army. But eventually, Netaji convinced her father to let her join. And she not only fought. I said to her, so how often had you been to India, Janaki? And she said, well, I had never been to India. The first time I went to India, the first time I kissed the soil of India was in Manipur with a rifle in my hand. A story like this is something that cannot be forgotten. Fortunately, at least Janaki was given the Padma Shri by the Vajpayee government. So she has received recognition. But there are many thousands of others who fought like the Balak Sena, who contributed to the Indian Independence League. Hundreds of businessmen in Bangkok, in Kuala Lumpur, in Rangoon or Yangon and Singapore, who contributed to the cause of Indian independence. And it is, I think it is tragic that we as a nation have forgotten them, have not given them even an iota of recognition. So what we heard today, I think, is important. It is very important that we understand and recognize the enormous role that these patriots in Southeast Asia played in helping to bring independence to the nation from which they had moved to Southeast Asia in previous generations. So Janaki, the late Janaki Thevar is no longer with us, but her story is typical. There was others. There's Rusama Bopalan, who became one of the greatest educationists in Malaysia. Among her students was Anwar Ibrahim, who was her student in school. But when she wrote her autobiography, she dedicated it to my leader, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Free India. So the loyalty that they felt was lifelong. And these were people of great intelligence, Rusama and Janaki, and they dedicated their lives for India's freedom. And it is time that we recognize them and the thousands of others who fought in the Azad Hind Force for India's independence. So thank you. I really would like to thank the Vivekananda Cultural Center of the embassy in Bangkok for giving me this opportunity. And may I just say, Namaskar, Jai Hind, Jai Parakram Divas. It's wonderful that at last we recognize the valor of of Netaji and also of the Azad Hind Force through this day that will be celebrated forever afterwards in independent India.
Thank you so much, Mr. Basu. It was an honor that you spoke for us. I would also like to thank Her Excellency, Mrs. Suchitra Durai, who's been present with us here through the program. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Purna.
Thank you, ma'am. And
I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Basu and also all members of the Thai-Bharat Cultural Lodge. I think we've had a enormously close and mutually beneficial relationship with all members of the Thai-Bharat Cultural Lodge, with whom the embassy has been working very closely. And you mentioned, of course, Mr. Basu, the very long-standing links between India and this part of the world. And that is indeed recognized and nurtured by every government of India, and particularly the present government with its Act East policy has been working on it. And on several fronts, political, cultural, commercial, economic, defense and security, every sector, we have been working very hard to further consolidate our relations. And that is being seen. We have a strategic partnership between India and the ASEAN. We have strategic partnerships with many countries of the region. And this is, of course, evident in the kind of things which are happening in several areas of our bilateral and our multilateral relationship. So once again, I would like to thank you, Mr. Basu, and all others who have spoken this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you.
On this note, we'll end this session. Thank you so much, everybody. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.